All right, so in this question, the questioner wants to know, why do brackets and parentheses in interval notation make a difference? Why do they matter? So let's talk a little bit about how interval notation works. Really, interval notation is something that pre-calculus professors love to get hung up on. It's a very common way of expressing an idea in mathematics. Specifically, whenever we're talking about a question whose answer is not a number, but whose answer is a set of numbers. So, for instance, let's say I have a question that says to describe the set of all, let's say, real numbers. I don't know, between 2 and 5. So this is a really elementary question to do, and if one way of sort of understanding what an answer to this question might consist of might be to just quickly sketch a picture. And we might sketch a picture of the object that we're talking about here by just thinking about the real number line. Maybe labeling a couple of points on it or something. So down here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so forth. Whoops. 1, 2, 3, yada, yada. Real numbers also include the negative integers. Don't forget, too, that when we talk about real numbers, we're also including every number in between. So something like 0.2691123 ... We also have funky irrational numbers like the square root of 2 belongs in here, et cetera, et cetera. So real numbers include a lot, everything in between the gaps, if you will. That's actually one of the more rigorous ways of defining what the real numbers are. It's everything in the gaps in between the integers and therefore in the gaps in between the rational numbers as well. Anyway, if we want to describe the set of all real numbers between 2 and 5, we might well go in and say, well, where is that set on this real number line? And we would shade the piece of the number line in between 2 and 5 and say, here it is. And to put that into notation, in other words, to give it some written form, what we would say is that, so 2 is the left-hand extreme of this set of numbers. 5 is the right-hand extreme in this set of numbers. But there's one thing that this notation doesn't tell you, and neither too does the question that was asked here. It's a very ill-posed question. And the thing that the question doesn't tell you is the question doesn't tell you, do we want to include the numbers 2 and 5 themselves? That's the thing about the word between. As an English word, we kind of have a sense of what it means colloquially, but mathematically, it's not a strong enough word to tell us whether we're going to include 2 and 5. So if I were to ask you, is 2 a number between 2 and 5? You might say yes, you might say no, and there would be really kind of no way for us to adjudicate that. So brackets and parentheses matter in interval notation because they specify the answer to that particular question. So square brackets are used if the answer is yes. In other words, if we want to include a number in our set, in our answer, we'll put a square bracket next to it. Whereas round parentheses would be used if we want not to include such number in our solution. So let's make our question a little bit better. Let's put a finer point on it. Instead of saying just between 2 and 5, because that's not specific enough mathematically to let us know whether to use square brackets or parentheses in our answer, let's say this. Let's describe the set of all numbers that are greater than 2, but no more than 5. So now I've used slightly more specific language to describe the set that we're talking about. So if I want to know whether to use a round bracket or a square bracket, a round parenthesis or a square bracket in my interval notation, I'm going to take those two numbers themselves, 2 and 5, and ask whether they belong to our solution. Is 2 a number which is greater than 2 but not greater than 5? No more than 5. Well, it's certainly true that 2 is no more than 5, so that part of it is true. But is it true that 2 is a number greater than 2? It is not true. So in other words, because we've been more specific about the nature of the inclusion of 2 here, 2 is not in fact a number greater than 2 and no more than 5, because 2 is not greater than 2. That means that we want not to include the number 2 in our final answer to this question. And because we want not to include it, we'll put a round parenthesis next to it. So that round parenthesis tells me that the number 2 is not a part of my answer. And yet, every number which is greater than 2 will be. So 2.000000001 or something like that. Something really, really close to 2, but not equal to 2. That's going to be a part of this final answer. But 2 itself will not be, because I've used that round bracket. And I've used that round bracket because I looked back at the description of this set and said, does 2 belong? Is 2 itself a part of this set? And the answer was no, so I used the round parentheses. On the other hand, if I ask the same question about the number 5, then is 5 a number which is greater than 2, and no more than 5? And the answer to that question is yes. After all, 5 is indeed greater than 2, so that first portion is satisfied. Also, 5 is no more than 5. Right? 5 is not, in fact, more than 5, not greater than 5. And therefore, we answer that question in the affirmative. In other words, 5 does belong to our answer. It does belong to the set that we're talking about as the solution of this problem. And because it does belong, we'll use a square bracket. So square brackets and round parentheses in interval notation, their job is to tell you whether or not the endpoints themselves, the extremes, the left side and the right side, whether those numbers themselves are actually a part of the solution or not. If the answer is no, we use a parenthesis. If the answer is yes, we use a square bracket. And when in doubt, literally just ask yourself the question about each of those endpoints specifically. Single it out. Is 2 a part of this set? We asked ourselves that question, and the answer was no, so we put a round parenthesis around it. Is 5 an element of this set? If the answer is no, then we would use a parenthesis, but here the answer was yes, so we use a square bracket.